Hello, everyone, and welcome to the live stream. I'm John Lorenzini, aka JLo, the VP of Marketing Science here at LiftLab. Before we get started, I'd like to take a second to introduce the series Curve Your Enthusiasm. Curve Your Enthusiasm is conversations with experts on the front lines of growth marketing, analytics, and measurement. From the boardrooms to the classrooms, we have a great blend of academics, practitioners, and strategists, all nerding out while trying to keep it completely jargon-free. The curve in Curve Your Enthusiasm speaks to the diminishing returns curve that all marketers face, which is a topic of discussion today. Today's episode is called The Past, Present, and Future of Measurement and Marketing Analytics and is broken up into three topics. The first topic being universal truths, which are foundational concepts that tee up the rest of this conversation. The second is the timeline of where measurement was, where it is, and where it's going. And then finally, the third topic, which is the methodologies or metrics that are in, that are out, and clearly defining what they're actually measuring. After our topics, we will have a Q&A session, but audience who's live right now on LinkedIn, feel free to pepper in some questions. I'll get them fed to me, and if we could work them in, we'll work them in live and organically into the conversations. Otherwise, we'll cover them at the end. Now, let's meet our speakers. First up, we have the co-founder of LiftLab, previous founder of DataSong, which successfully exited to market share, and some of the current DNA that's in Neustar, John Wallace. Now, if this was a live show, there would be applause, but hi, John. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Joe.
Next up, we have the godfather of econometric models, cited over 16,600 times on Google Scholar, with some as far back as 1976, the writer of Market Response Models, Econometric and Time Series Analysis. He's also a distinguished research professor of marketing at UCLA, as well as the editor or previous editor of several academic journals, Dominique Hanssens. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning or good afternoon. Good to be here.
Hopefully I didn't make you blush with that intro.
A little bit.
Well, great to have you both here and excited to get started. Also, thank you again for everyone who's showing up in the live stream. Again, feel free to ask some questions. I'll get them fed by the producer in the side. And I just wanted to say producer, so we seem like a big budget production. Great. If we want to jump right in, I think the first topic is what are the fundamentals of marketing that have always been true? And I'll kick that off with Dominique Hanssens here, or Mike.
All right. Well, thank you, JLo. Yes, well, quick on a few fundamentals. There are, of course, many, but I will hone in here on some really important ones. When it comes to marketing communications, advertising, and other forms of communications, what holds universally is the principle of diminishing returns. And what that means simply is that, generally speaking, your first $1,000 on a particular campaign will work better than the second 1,000, and so on and so forth. You have an example there in the graph that's shown of what a fairly typical response curve looks like. So you see a fairly steep increase at low levels of spend, and then it still increases, but at a lower degree. Okay, that is the notion of diminishing returns. Now, there's a very, very important consequence of that, and that is the impact of the spending on your profitability, which is shown there in the blue curve. It will initially go up. It could be negative if you underspend. And then it gets better and better. It reaches a peak, and then it goes down because at the margin, your next spend is no longer strong enough. The effect is no longer strong enough to cover its costs. So you see this inverted U curve that tends to go along with it. Now, where does this diminishing returns comes from? It comes from a couple of sources. The first one is sort of management induced by virtue of the fact that it makes a lot of economic sense to spend your first dollars on your best prospects and then later dollars on lesser prospects. So that creates diminishing returns in and of itself. But there's a couple of other reasons. The second one has to do, we know from psychology that the effects of repetition actually max out. They max out at around 3 or 4, meaning that if you keep repeating yourself with a message and you reach that message to the same audience, they get reached, let's say, 3 or 4 times, number 5, 6, and 7 repetition isn't going to add very much anymore. Okay? If they don't get it after 3 or 4, they don't get it, in other words, or they're not interested in it. So that creates diminishing returns. Okay? And then the third source is only for durable products. If you think about buying cars or television sets or whatever expensive products, at any point in time, there's only so many people in the market. And so if your marketing campaign is very successful and people buy, you actually reduce the size of the market because there's only so many at any point in time that are shopping for that kind of product. So for these three reasons, a very fundamental aspect of response to advertising, in particular, marketing communications, is the diminishing returns phenomenon. So that's number one. The second one that I want to point into is, of course, we're very, very interested here in the effects of marketing communications, but let us not forget that marketing is more than just the communications efforts. After all, you are selling a product or a service. You are distributing it in certain places and maybe not in other places. And so there is a strong, and you're using a certain price point. Turns out we know from the marketing analytics literature that these other factors are actually very strong. Now, if these other factors are the same over time, then you don't need to worry about it. But if you, for example, occasionally offer a discount for your product while you're advertising, then you should expect that advertising that goes with the discounting to have a stronger effect. Likewise, if you're introducing a new product, we tend to see stronger advertising response to new products than to existing products for the very simple reason that you're telling consumers something they don't already know. And by the same token, distribution has a strong effect as well. So I'll stop here just to point out that when we try to measure the effects of our marketing communications, that we should be a bit holistic and not just look at the execution itself, but also ask fundamental questions such as, what exactly are we advertising? Who are we talking to? And how much are we spending?
Got it. So I guess if we were looking at this from a digital media, new media, this is streaming on LinkedIn, there's only a given market size. And as you spend into it, you run out of people who are likely to purchase. But also within the platforms, there's propensity score or likelihood to buy that as you spend, you get lesser and lesser qualified audiences, as well as higher and higher auction pressure. So would this accelerate those diminishing returns curves?
It certainly can. You raise a very good point, and the degree to which it accelerates it can be derived from the data, because what you really need is how steep is the curve between the response to your advertising and the spend of your advertising. And if the slope is very shallow, that suggests that you are encountering the very factors that you're talking about.
I see. Great. If we want to shift gears, so I think that was a great fundamental setting up diminishing returns, saying as you spend in and marginal concepts, which we're going to hit in the metrics section. But I'd love to get your opinion. You know, your first cited paper was 1976. So you have seen a lot of measurement over the years. Could you give us a little bit about where, analytics measurement was and where do you think it currently is and what needs to change in the future?
Sure, yes, I've seen this since about the 1970s. You're totally right, unfortunately for me. But I would summarize it as follows. It's been driven mainly by advances in data and computer technology. So, for example, in the 1980s, we had the barcode revolution, where suddenly manufacturers put barcodes on just about everything. That created a revolution in our ability to understand what actually is selling at the point of purchase and at what price and with what advertising support. Before that, we only had accounting measures. Now we have real sales measures at the point of purchase. Okay? Then a second revolution came, about 20 years later, the one you've alluded to already, is the digital media, which opened a whole array of opportunities, basically to collect direct consumer feedback, like in social media, that we didn't have before. And so from a modeling perspective, it all started with these simple databases on which you build marketing mix models. And a marketing mix model just basically collects the data on the different elements of marketing. What's your price, what's your product, and so forth, what's your ad spend, and tries to relate that to sales using econometric methods. That worked very well, still works very well. But it tended to be restricted to large companies who had the resources to put these databases together and pay for the analysis. What's happened then with the digital revolution is really that MTA came about. MTA stands for multi-touch attribution, which is where you're looking at individual consumers or households, and you trace sort of their journey towards purchasing your product, and you look at how particular messages or actions influence the probability that you will eventually buy the product. And that's also going very well. But there was, of course, a problem that happened, maybe I think about 5 years ago or so, with various suppliers and now pretty much everybody restricting the use of third-party cookies. And with the restriction of third-party cookies, suddenly a whole array of very interesting data was no longer available. And that has actually led some companies to actually go back to MMM, go back to marketing mix, which is more aggregate, indeed, but allows for all the elements of the marketing mix to come into play. And then, of course, there is another development, and that's one, of course, where LiftLab has been a pioneer, and that is to argue, look, these historical data are fine, but they're not perfect. And sometimes you want to do an experiment to find out what really happens in a certain market when you control the conditions, with a test group and a control group. And what LiftLab does, I think, is kind of state of the art in that they're blending methods. They're saying, we use marketing mix, but we also use experiments, and we blend them in a way that produces much, much higher quality answers to the critical questions about where you should be spending your money. So that's sort of a brief overview of how I see this.
So I guess you could say that the MMM is historical. Kind of as soon as barcodes came out, MMMs were fast follow. Then we had a little bit of a middle ground of last click with the digital technology, a user clicking something. But then they had to say, well, one user shouldn't get all that credit. And that's where MTA came out. And isn't that how you and John Walls first met, when you two were at Market Share? When you were at Market Share and John was at DataSong selling DataSong to Market Share. John, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, that was the moment that I was to be raked over the coals by a professor. We had developed an algorithm for multi-touch attribution, and Market Share was on the precipice of acquiring the company, and the due diligence phase was where I met Dr. Hanssens. So and that's probably in part how we're still here together, collaborating. I called him up a few years ago and said, I have an idea to apply econometrics to experimental data sets. Can you talk me out of it? Is this something that really the market needs or doesn't need? And I guess the answer was yes, because we went and built it, and he's been contributing to our milestones along the way.
And John, with the transition, because I think the MMM to MTA was a big transition, and now it's MTA sort of not quite backwards. There's a bunch of modifications and changes since the legacy MMM. Could you explain kind of why you think that MMM versus MTA, why this change is occurring now, and what does that mean for the industry overall?
Yeah, it really anybody's model that they're going to sit down and build is a function of the data that they're starting with, that they begin with. And I think, maybe the most proverbial version of it is garbage in, garbage out. And what we were doing with MTA data sets originally was looking at all the touches that happened and then saying, and in what case did that go on to lead to a conversion? And what case did that go on to not lead to conversion, right? So they were response models. With the changes in data collection, instead of it looking like some person was exposed to 6 touches, it looks like 6 different people were all exposed to 1 touch. And that kind of brittle data, that data that's kind of fallen apart, you no longer see the path to purchase the way that you used to be able to. So there's not really any safe way to build algorithms to fix that data. It's troubled from the onset. And really, marketing mix data sets are not facing that problem, right? So for us, it was how do we let go of all of our MTA thinking and start fresh with the next generation of marketing mix. And then, as Dr. Hanssens pointed out, just having a thoughtful way to recognize when are these data sets that we're working with in our mixed models troubled, and do we have a way to remediate that? And we really lean on experiments to go gather auxiliary data to kind of bolster these data sets when they need the help.
Mike, since you've seen longitudinally a whole bunch of different changes between barcodes to MMM to last click to MTA, sort of the path back to MMM, what do you think are the sort of hangovers, relics, things you would want the industry or practitioners of measurement to know to say, hey, keep doing this, stop doing this, or anything in between?
Yeah, okay. Well, it's a very, very good question. So I would say I would point mainly into the need to use these methods correctly, because they're no longer simplistic. This is getting sophisticated. And when things are getting sophisticated, you run into the potential for misuse or misunderstanding what the results really mean. So, for example, it's very, very important, and we'll talk about this later, to make the distinction between top line versus bottom line, the results of marketing. And not all companies do that correctly. It is also very important to understand, and this is what LiftLab is. When is it that you need an experiment? Well, you need an experiment, for example, when there is something you want to try out, but you've never done it before. So there's no data. I see in a lot of the LiftLab data, for example, I see that they always advertise online, always, sometimes more than sometimes less. But then if you're always advertising, you don't know what would happen if you stopped advertising. But companies are very reluctant to do that because they're afraid of losing money, of course. Okay? But maybe with an experiment or maybe a small market where you say, okay, why don't you stop advertising there for a month? A small market, you won't lose your shirt, but we'll learn about how much of the sales results that you get are due to the strength of your brand versus how much do you need to augment that with various forms of communications. Okay? And there's many other examples like that, but the experiments are actually wonderful to fill the holes in the data, if you wish. And as a result, we're going in a direction, I would say, where we combine different methods. Experimentation is one method, econometrics is another method. Now we have all the machine learning, which takes advantage of computer tools to actually very, very rapidly update the results. Okay? So it's clearly a world in which there is a combination of methods that will do well. And then my hope is that it gets applied to the right metrics. We'll talk about this at some point, but should you look at short-term results? Should you look at long-term results? There's a great deal of ambiguity around that. Okay? So those are some questions that I think point to a very interesting future for marketing analytics, in which certainly not all problems have been solved, but the data are great. The software that we have now is great. Okay? It is sort of awaiting the correct use with the multi-method approach to solve important marketing problems.
Yep. And Mike, I think you hit a really interesting point of, and this is a delineation that I've made in my head, of analysts versus marketing science. And really the difference is analysts collect, account, and observe, while scientists, marketing science, kind of boxes with the consumer in a way through testing, through having different frequency, being on, being off, different varying levels of investment to receive better information. I think, John, you probably use this quote more than anyone in terms of if someone is data sparse or they don't have good data, what do you typically recommend advertisers do?
If they're missing data or their data doesn't lend itself to analysis, you need to go make new data.
Yeah. Right.
Sweet. Cool. I definitely just wanted to prompt you for that one, because this is something that echoes in LiftLab. It's like, if you have bad data, create better data through testing. Great. So I think that covers the first section. So we're going to go ahead and move on to what metrics are commonplace, but ultimately misleading, and what needs to change. So this is a little bit more on the evolution of where things are going. So I think the first topic, Mike, you hit this with the diminishing returns curve, but would love for you to tell us of why the average is the enemy here for marketers and optimizers.
Yes, indeed. It follows directly from the graph that we talked about earlier. Look, if the effects of marketing were a straight line, then averages would be just fine. Because whether you measure the first 1,000, the second 1,000, or whatever, the average is always the same because the response is a straight line. Unfortunately, that's not true for reasons that we just discussed. There are these diminishing returns. Now, what does that mean for diminishing returns? Okay, I mean, it means, first of all, that you have to stop looking at these averages because they're not comparable. So if you have one campaign that, or you pick one touch point and you spend $1,000, and you pick another touch point and you spend $10,000, and then you compare the results, you can't do that, because the second, you're actually going to bias against the second one because you're spending much more. Okay? So you have to go away from the averages. And that is typically, it's problematic in management for the following reason. For all the right financial reasons, managers like to talk about returns. Okay, so for example, if we both invest in the same stock, we buy at the same day for the same price, let's say $100, you buy 1,000 shares, I buy 100 shares. A year later, we sell at the exact same price, let's say $120. Your return for your 1,000 shares is exactly the same as mine with my 100 shares. Okay, so the size of the investment doesn't matter. But in marketing, it does because of the diminishing returns. Okay? You should expect a higher return, in other words, from a small investment than from a large investment. And that, of course, can lead companies to underinvest, okay? Because they set a certain standard, but they don't realize that, or cutoff point, if you wish, for returns, but they don't realize that that cutoff point slides down as you invest more. So that can create some very serious problems in misallocation. So what you really should be doing is not looking at the return on your dollars, but look at the return on your last dollar. Now, I don't mean here literally the last dollar. It could be the last $100, the last $1,000, but the highest point in your spending. In other words, is that still a metric that is sufficiently high to justify the expense? And what you will see then is, what we all learned in school years ago, I guess. You spend until your marginal cost is equal to your marginal revenue, okay? Which is the point where your marginal return is going to be exactly zero. In other words, you're indifferent between spending more or spending less because you're exactly at the 0 point. Okay? And where is that 0 point? Well, guess what? That is exactly at the point where you make the most money. If you remember that my little chart of a few minutes ago, you saw that inverted U shape for profits, that maximum profit level, that is equal to, that's the point where your marginal returns become zero. Now, in the methods that John talked about with LiftLab, the combination of historical data analysis and experiments, we draw these curves and in very, very reliable ways. And then we find exactly the point where the spending no longer pays for itself. And that is a big change in thinking. Go away from these average return metrics to return of the last dollar, if you wish, in order to make the appropriate decision. So that is really that's really the major thing. And the challenge here is you need the curves. The averages are easy because anybody can calculate an average, but you sort of need to know what slope are you on. Are you on a very strongly increasing slope where another $1 million may do very well, or is it starting to taper off? Okay, and that's where companies like LiftLab do such a good job in actually pointing to exactly where you are with respect to each marketing investment, each touch point, each medium, and so forth.
If I can just take Mike's comment and turn it into what I see run by marketers. We all struggle with some of the same, bad revenue data that's reported on last click, or it's reported as reported by an ad platform. And typically the first, anecdote or correction to that would be, let's run a conversion lift test. But that conversion lift test is going to give you an average. At that average spend during the experiment, this was my performance, but it isn't giving you the curves that we're referring to, right? That's so, even though it's aspirational, let's run a lot of conversion lift tests, they're still going to fall short of teaching you, am I near the inflection point, of this view? So just kind of taking the exact statements from Dr. Hanssen and just mapping them over to what we see as practitioners, right? Is those tests that do get you the average incremental performance, it's better than nothing, right? It's a step forward. It's completely, I endorse them as a step in the right direction, but they are going to fall short of giving you this level of diagnostic.
Yeah, and this was definitely something that with my previous publisher experience, when I transitioned over to LiftLab, learning about marginal versus the average is definitely something that I think is really important for optimization decisions, because if you have an ROAS of 2, that's your average performance, not what your first dollars did or your last dollars. And what we find is, as you run an experiment on a platform of conversion lift test, we see that p-value pop at the beginning, right? You have such a difference between the control and the expose because the propensity score is so high. The people that you hit with your ad first are so ready to buy that the ad works really well. And because of that, you have such a great performance. But then as you start to spend in, you get lesser and lesser qualified, and that tapers off pretty quickly. So what we found was there was frequently a race of sample size versus difference between means, or the difference between the control group and the exposed group. So that early p-value pop is really speaking to that propensity of that sharp incline in the beginning when you launch on a digital platform, and then the tapering off as you start to scale, especially if you have frequency caps, reach goals, etc. So it's something that we see on both sides of measurement, but I think that the marginal side says not just what is your return, but rather what is the right level that you should invest in to get the return, or the trade-off between growth and profitability that you're seeking. Cool.
I'll
If
just
we
run
wanna...
one simple example, like maybe the most common mistake that I see made, and it took me probably a couple meetings with Dr. Hanssens for this to sink in personally, but it's to see someone run an incrementality test, come back with a number like the average incremental ROAS is 3, and make the conclusion that because of this test, if I spend another $1, that it will return 3. And that's just not true. It's very tempting to take that result and drop it into a spreadsheet and run a forecast, but you're going to miss your forecast, right? And because when you spend the extra $1, let's say during the experiment you were spending $1,000 a day, when you bump your spend up to some other number, $1,100, you don't get to buy that very early performance again. You've already committed to it with the first $1,000. So you're buying something that's not working quite as well. And so you, by definition, are going to see some return less than 3. And it's really, we keep referring here to curves, and it's the name of the show. It's the curves that teach you how below 3 is this additional spend going to perform.
And I think this brings us to a question from the audience. The first one is, how do you adapt these recommendations for small companies without big budgets? And i.e., you can't afford to test, assume you mean full-scaled markets, but limited spend to begin with, need to consider cash flow so that top of funnel acquisition is challenging to justify but necessary. So it sounds like cash flow versus return. How do we test or spend into something that's an emerging brand?
I would say start simple. I'm going to assume here that I appreciate the challenges being a smaller company, but you do have your sales data, and you do have your advertising spend data, and try to, even if it's very simple, try to get an overall impression of how steep is the response curve. It may lack a lot of detail at this point, but it's a very, very good start. And if you break it down, let's say, for example, let's say you have 2 major touch points, you may well see that the curve for one is much steeper than the curve for the other. And then that dictates not that you should put all of your eggs in one basket, but rather that you should allocate according to a ratio. The ratio is given by the steepness of the curves. Okay? So start simple, and go ahead and put in, and of course, if you have cash flow restraints and all that, I totally understand that. You may be less return focused and more cash flow focused, which is totally fine. And in fact, that gets you closer to the profitability notion, because profit and cash flow are strongly correlated. So that's what I would recommend.
And I'm just going to take the example from before, JLo, and apply it to what Dr. Hanssens just shared. If you have one touch point that has an incremental ROAS of 3 from the early example, and another one that has an incremental ROAS of 5, it's another mistake that I've seen made in marketing is to conclude, well, I should place all my bets on the higher of the two. And that's actually not the right answer, right? That is a winner take all mentality. And that's almost never the right answer in marketing, right? The right answer is buy all of the efficient media from touch point one, and then buy the other efficient media from touch point two. And that's a very, simple example of optimizing a portfolio of, or a media plan.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think at the simplest level, right, if you had a low, medium, and high spend like category, then you would have 3 points on that curve for a channel.
Mhm.
And if you're spending up and spending down against those 3 buckets of how many dollars, let's say 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, right? You're going to start drawing that curve based off of the response you get back from the market in aggregate sales. Now, it might not be tracked one-to-one like MTA, but we actually prefer that because as you're spending up and spending down, does it hit the cash register? Because if it doesn't, you're starting to flatten out. And if you do that across a different set of touch points or different channels, you're basically building diminishing returns curve across and executing in a way that doesn't require those big budgets. One of the great things about being a new brand is most of your stuff's incremental. If no one's heard of you, they're all new. So that's one of the ways that you can test on a smaller scale. We're starting to get quite a few more questions coming in here. Maybe the next
there was
one
actually, J-Lo, another part to that question. That was like a multi-part question. I just want to make sure we touch on it. It felt like there was a question of opportunity costs. Like, hey, we're a smaller brand, and are we going to forego? And I think that's our first answer here, I think, was to encourage the person to ask a question to at least take their data and run it through a model, right? That was the first part. I think there's another way to interpret the question was, am I a candidate to run experiments? And I think, and trying to read and parse the question, when it comes to the topic of opportunity cost, I always have the same answer. Boy, do I hope there's an opportunity cost, because if you stop spending and nothing happens to the results of your top line, then you have a bigger problem than just losing out on the. Actually, you just saved yourself a lot of money, right? So no, I encourage people to look quickly past the opportunity cost. They will get recuperated very quickly if there's lift that's found, and you can then exploit that nationally. You do need to have the discipline to kind of sacrifice some very short-term results in order to really continue to bank the savings and efficiency over the long term. Cool. All right.
Cool. I think this next question actually relates to our next topic about attributed versus incremental. So your ROAS versus your iROAS versus your marginal iROAS or mROAS. We spoke on that first part, but the question is, I understand the value of mROAS, but how do I get my agency partners and teams aligned to this new truth? So a little bit of change management kind of discussions about maybe they were measuring by a ROAS last click yardstick. How do we get them into the mROAS? And this might be a little bit more to John because he's in the field with the agency teams and the clients a little bit more than Mike.
Yeah, I mean, you do have to have both parties on board. I don't think the agency can act alone, right? This is the marketer's P&L, and vice versa. I think if the marketer's got this vision and they can't get their agency on board, then their agency's kind of living in the past or living in the dark. So it really does take executive sponsorship to say we're going to retire these inferior metrics in favor of something stronger. And then, I mean, I feel like I'm stating the obvious, and then tie the incentives to that as well, right? You can't say I'm still going to pay you based on, call it, performance in Facebook revenue, or I call it Facebook dollars, right, or Google dollars or platform dollars, but then try to optimize using something else. I feel like it's stating the obvious. So I think it could be LiftLab's role or your marketing science team's role to explain the concepts to the agency if they have questions about it. Like I said, it took me a couple of times working with Dr. Hanssen for it all to sink in. But once it's there, then it's simple. It does fall under change management. Can we align the incentives with better metrics?
Yeah. And I think the way to kind of explain what these three, because there's 3 different metrics and they tell different stories, right? Your ROAS is what happened and how qualified was your audience, basically, right? If it
Mhm.
doesn't really say, does advertising work? That's ROAS, because you're removing the baseline, you're removing what would have happened anyways without the advertising. So
I
ROAS is
for
now that.
incremental here. Yeah, that's our,
Yep,
yeah, incremental ROAS.
exactly. And then MIROAS or MROAS is with those incremental dollars, what did that last dollar do, or where along the curve are you for that specific value? And really that's where you want to optimize, because if you optimize on averages, you have to keep spending bad money before your average drops below your goals. If you're using the marginal, you know the second it drops below, and then you could reallocate those dollars to higher performing channels. Um, cool. Let's
I mean,
move
I
in.
think if you have those three metrics, the platform ROAS, the incremental ROAS, and the marginal ROAS, it does kind of simplify down to you're more likely to hit your forecast if you're making investments by understanding the marginal effects, right? Like if we all have, and I think the agencies are on board, they want to see their clients at their forecast. So that's ends up being the rallying point is, we know we're not going to hit our forecast every time, but how do we increase our odds of hitting our forecast? Or let's also reserve the room to say, we can't get to this forecast with this much paid media, right? I'd rather know that ahead of time and give guidance and be able to take an intervention, be it more spend or be it another promo or something like that, than to just miss the forecast.
Makes sense. Now, with the experimentation, creating better data, MROAS, IROAS, and drawing these curves, one of the questions that came up, and there's two questions I'm going to combine into one, which is how reasonable is it to apply curves that were built on a specific creative frequency audience and then apply them to new creative audience and different frequency of the same channel? So this first piece is how stale, how do experiments apply, or how generalizable are they?
Okay. Well, my again, very very good question. Well, what you've done here, what the listener basically proposes, is that the ad spend now has two additional components to it. One is creative, and the other one is frequency. Right? Now, frequency can be handled by virtue of the repetition stuff we talked about. With higher frequency, you should expect the returns to go down for reasons that we've already explained. And so that's number one. But the creative is very interesting. What I've done, because creative is tough to model in a spreadsheet. Okay? So what you tend to do to keep it simple is give each creative execution, basically a different baseline. You say, if we use creative A versus creative B versus creative C, let us see if there is a systematic difference in the response to A versus B versus C. Okay? That requires basically another field that basically says, okay, you spent this much on this touch point, and it was using creative A, B, or C. And econometrically, you can figure out whether these creatives really matter. Okay? Since very recently, by the way, there's a lot of academic work on actually representing creative, and that gets into text analysis. It gets quite sophisticated. So I just wanted to make you aware that there's a lot of work happening in that arena. But to keep things simple, allow your creative to be designated as a different type, and then check whether or not there is a systematic difference in response depending on creative. Okay? That would be my general approach to this.
Got it. How about the staleness of these experiments? So we spoke about the generalizability. Another question here that came in that was related is how long before an experiment goes stale?
Well, I don't view it as much as going stale. I view it as more in the arena of when the results start to stabilize. Okay? So you say you have A versus B. Okay, that's your experiment. And B is what you normally do, and A is your experiment. And you see a certain response that differs. But, if you have daily data, it can be subject to widespread fluctuations. But after a couple of days or a couple of weeks, the darn thing starts to stabilize. Okay? If you stabilize, then that's enough evidence for you that you can make an inference that's going to be generalizable. Okay? So, but I don't know from marketing theory that that's going to happen after 1 week or 6 months. Okay? It's an empirical question. So look for stabilization of the results. And I would say in most cases, you really see that. You see that eventually happen. And that's when it's time to stop and pick whichever scenario is best suited for your company.
I mean, I think there's a version of that question that's, if I run a successful experiment in January, how long should I, continue to use that result? And the common way I've seen this done in-house is to try to say, let's run an experiment like an online conversion lift test. Let's get a factor. And now we're going to, going forward, apply that factor to the numbers coming out of the platform. And I think if that's your toolkit, I would be leery of keeping those results around for too long. What's happening in this approach, this kind of hybrid approach, is that we're going to keep looking at data with our model and keep adjusting these curves. So they're not completely pinned in time like that example I gave where you're using this to make a factor. This is a more dynamic system. And so it's hard to give there's not really a rule of thumb to answer this question. Your mileage will vary. If your models are moving around quite a bit, then it might be evidence for an earlier experiment, or a retest. If things are kind of more stable, then you might let that experiment result plus what the model continues to see stand longer. So we've got diagnostics for that, but there's not a rule of thumb to say, an experiment. Again, and under this, we had to answer this a slightly different question. I'm turning the question into, if you have an experiment plus model framework, how long does that experiment last? If you don't have an experiment plus model framework, if it's all point in time experiments, you're going to have to experiment much more frequently.
Yeah, and I think the comment that every analyst will say when asked a question, so if you just want a shortcut, just the answer is it depends, right? With almost every question. It's annoyingly conditional. But can we talk about a little bit? We mentioned iROAS and platform ROAS. Sounds like you could just leave out an MTA tool if you wanted to. How, if at all, would you recommend using MTA tool as part of this overall framework? And this one I'll kick over to either of you, John, since you built an MTA company, or Mike, because you evaluated through the MTA company whether they got the goods.
Yeah.
I mean, do you leave out I think at this day and age, there are fewer and fewer companies willing to put much weight or confidence into the MTA results due to changes in data, right? So it's not a shortcoming of the algorithms or anything like that. It's just this data has become, more and more fragmented. I like my expression. It's like you have Swiss cheese and the holes keep getting bigger. The holes in the data are getting bigger. So I think in the spirit of the question, yes, this does not take the same course through the data, but it does give you some of the same outputs, in some cases better outputs than I've seen for most MTA approaches. So it is, in that sense, I guess it's an alternative, but I'm saying mostly not about one mousetrap is better. It's really an alternative out of necessity because the data sets no longer lend themselves to sophisticated analysis.
Yeah. Cool. The next question we got here, I might actually take this one because this is my bone to pick with the industry. This question is, how does this change the KPIs I use to measure my team when my channels are fixated on last click? How do I get executive buy-in on the metrics that matter? So I have a couple analogies for you that I would use for this change management. If you're flying to a conference, according to last click, you walk there. If you're at a bar, the last shot is the only one that gets you drunk, not all the other ones. If you're walking into a shoe store and someone says, hey, you should buy those shoes that you have in your hand about at the cash register, are they the ones that are responsible for making you make that purchase? No. All it's doing, you know what the number one seller of every retail store is? It's the door before you walk in. They have convinced you to sell every product. So then the question is, are you forking people onto the road of conversion, or are you a toll booth along the way? And with last click, what's really good about last click is just saying how qualified is your audience? How far away from that door is your audience? It does not tell you whether or not advertising works. Google branded search or Bing branded search, any branded search, you're pretty much there. When I was selling Dell XPS 15 computers, when someone typed that in, they weren't casually browsing for computers. They were pretty close to purchase. So that is my bone to pick on last click. Hopefully one of those analogies resonate. I don't know with senior leadership if you should use shots at a bar as an example, but hopefully that's a toolkit to help you with that change management.
Well, it's like saying you have a reporting system that concludes that ambulances kill people, right? It's a similar type of fallacy that we're using as our main accounting in the, to see channel performance. That's the method that we're using to do accounting, and it is fundamentally flawed. I think what I said earlier still applies here. I think you have to walk in and let the boss know that we're going to be more likely to hit our forecast if we invest in better numbers than like these, ambulance or shot glass examples, right? Those aren't really reliable methods to be running a marketing P&L, and they really need to be retired sooner than later.
Cool. Our last question is a little bit of a pivot, so we'll save that one for the Q&A. I definitely want to make sure that we're hitting on Bayesian versus frequentists. Mike, could you define the difference between the two and then tell us a little bit of pros and cons of each when you would use one versus the other?
Yeah, the Bayesian methodology has become very popular recently for good reason, even though it is, by the way, very, very old. The Reverend Bayes, who invented Bayesian thinking, lived in the 19th century. But it took till now for these methods to gain ground. Why? Because the formulas are so complex that there are no finite solutions that you can derive mathematically. So you need to simulate. But simulating is what computers do very well. You do 100,000 rounds and you see how numbers converge. So Bayesian is very, very popular now because it can be simulated with very rapid computers. Now, what's the difference? In a classical statistical sense, you let the data do all the work. You basically have a data set, you run a model, and those are the results, end of story. In Bayesian analysis, you say, well, it kind of depends on what you think going into the project. So in other words, you have a prior belief that the results should come out a certain way, and then you look at the data and it provides either a statement that your prior belief was very accurate or that it needs to be changed. And that's very powerful because as professionals, we all learn from previous experiments and from previous models, etc. So we form opinions about what the results should look like. And it turns out, and I'm going to skip the mathematics here, but if you build that into computer models, you can reduce the standard error, so you can increase the accuracy of your forecasts, right? And you can allow for imperfections in the data. For example, John's already talked about that. When you have missing data and other problems with the data, sometimes the Bayesian approach can really help in sorting that out. So it allows for the combinations of data. It allows for people to state what they think is going on, and as long as it's used wisely, okay, because it puts a lot of power in the hands of the analyst, okay? Because you can put your prior opinion in there, and if that prior opinion is very, very biased, then you're going to get very biased results, okay? But if you do it in a reasonable way, then with the modern computation methods, I would say that the Bayesian thinking has really done very, very well. And I'll let John give some examples on how it's being used at LiftLab, for example.
Yeah, I mean, we've embraced it like I think most of the industry. But the simplest one is to know that if we're building a model and there's an experiment that's present on the same channel, it can inform where the model should start its kind of search, right? And so it's just a very practical way to say, we're not going to inform the model from our opinion. We're going to inform it from a live experiment.
Exactly.
Moving to the next one, let's talk about long-term versus short-term metrics. Long-term being brand health, while the shorter term maybe being, conversions. And where does CAC to lifetime value fit in? So I just threw a little bit out there for you guys to comment on.
Yeah, all right, happy to do so. Of course, everything starts with short-term because the data are generally will produce pretty reliable answers on short-term effects. One of the reasons is that people tend to, if they react to marketing, they tend to react quickly. And so you tend to see the results in the same day, the same week, the same month, so relatively quickly after the experiments, excuse me, or after the expenditure. Long-term results, of course, are important for strategic reasons. And I would make the distinction here between long-term results that you can infer from the data versus long-term results from which you need different metrics. So in the first category, I mean, a very standard example is if your work, if you can demonstrate that your marketing campaign leads to the acquisition of 100 customers, and these customers each spend $20, and so there's $2,000 of extra revenue there. Okay. Now the question is, well, wait a minute. Are these customers only going to buy from us once? Hopefully they'll come back in the future. That you can derive from looking at the loyalty levels in the customer base. And so you can derive a long-term results from saying, okay, in the short term, we get the lift of $2,000, but you can probably multiply that by 2 or by 3 or 4, depending on your data, to say in the long run, we're going to get, let's say, $8,000 worth of revenue. And that completely changes, of course, the ROI. Okay? So that's a very, very good way to do it, so long as you're very careful to look at loyalty levels of customers in your business, which tends to depend more on the satisfaction with your product or service than on other factors. So that's point one. And then point two, of course, are specialized metrics. You've alluded to one, that's brand health, or brand awareness, brand equity, etc. Yes. And so if you have data on that, you can certainly take a look at whether or not your marketing helps your brand health indices. The challenge there is that that data tends to not being collected very frequently. But I think with digital databases going the way we are, it seems to me that you can track probably on a weekly basis, maybe even better, how your brand is doing in the minds of customers by looking at these other variety of internet-based metrics. Okay. The question there then, if you believe that brand health, let's say, is a valid long-term method, which it is, but you do need to take a look at, well, what does that do for me, my company? Okay. So you do need at some point some sort of a conversion that says, well, if my brand health goes up by 10%, what does that mean for me financially? And we know something about that. We know something that I'm quoting the results from a couple of colleagues of mine who did a large study of hundreds of studies. And so here's the consensus, that if your brand status goes up by 10%, your long-term financial results go up by about 3%. Okay, so that the elasticity is about 0.3. Okay, so it's good, okay, but careful. There are diminishing returns again. Okay, so if you are already 90% satisfaction levels, etc., that last 10% to 100% may not make that much difference. But we do have some very, very good instruments available now to infer that. And as I said, I just made the difference between those that you can infer yourself from the data versus those for which you need additional metrics.
John, I think you have a hill to die on, or maybe a soapbox. I don't know if that's the right term, in terms of CAC to lifetime value, depending on which market or which industry the business is in, right?
Yeah, I have a strong reservation, I guess we'll call it. I'm a big fan of understanding LTV. And that said, I have a strong reservation at trying to apply that to businesses that are not long-term. So if you have a durable contract with your customer, you have a pretty solid LTV with that. If on the other extreme, you have a new brand that has a large proportion of one and done customers, you really don't have much data to calculate a true LTV. You're probably looking at maybe a simple average. And so, and what okay, maybe this is the third mistake I'm citing here, and the common mistake I've seen in marketing is to take the CAC to LTV style of analysis and say, it costs me $100 to acquire this customer, and they spend $100 on breaking even, but on average, they're going to spend this much more. When people are doing that type of analysis, what they're often omitting is how much of the paid media was required to get the customer to come back a second time. Again, if there's no contract, it's not purely email that's going to get them coming back. It's not purely just the product quality, although you need both of those things. I posit that it's greater than zero, the amount of paid media needed to get all of those people to repeat purchase. And so you need to not only understand your CAC, but you need to understand your cost of retention, your paid cost of retention.
Great. All right, I think that covers most of the main topics we wanted to cover today. We have a couple more questions in the Q&A, but before that, I want to share the top 2 puns in the pun off regarding marketing science. You guys can vote in the comments. Eli has the pun, "Nobody is telling me that my data is being used to serve me an ad. It's just the impression that I get." And then Jennifer made one, "I made a joke about organic reach on Facebook, but nobody got it." Either one of those, whichever one of those 2 is your preference, let us know who wins. But now we have a couple more questions in the last 3 minutes. So let's go ahead and take a look here. How does seasonality play into my output, especially the usefulness of an experiment in a seasonal time period? This question's for either of you.
Absolutely. That's a very important question, and one that we have very good answers to, I think, from the econometric perspective. Is what is seasonality? It's that your baseline shifts over time. Even if you don't do any marketing at all, you do more business in June than in January, for example, due to seasonal fluctuations. So you need to put that in the model. So you need to treat June, July, August as, for example, separate base levels, and you can do that with dummy variables, indicators for different months, so that you actually get the contribution of each season or each month or each day, whatever, to the overall result. And then if you add your marketing, then your marketing will already control for the fact that the business is seasonal. So if your business automatically shoots up because from May to June, because of the nature of the business, and you advertise a lot in June, careful. That's not necessarily because of your advertising. It means probably because it's going up anyway. But if you put both sources of variation in most cases, you can in a very straightforward way, figure out how much is due to seasonality and how much is due to marketing.
Great. All right, we got one more question and 2 more minutes, so I think we're timing this perfectly, guys. We're using a trailing moving average. This is John Cripps. Hey, bud. We're using a trailing moving average of 90 or 180-day share of search average as a real-time measure of brand health. It works as well as you would expect, and it gets updated daily, free, large sample using Google Trends data. What are your thoughts of using Google Trends as a way to look at brand health, as well as, John, I'm teeing you up for potential outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great idea. I think what the question's pointing at is we're not restricted to only trying to look at survey-based data, right? There are alternatives that brands have access to say, what's the health of my brand? I think that that quote we got earlier was probably tied to that one with the 10% increase in brand health is a 3% increase in long-term firm performance. That might have been using survey data, and you might want to re-estimate that number using the Google Trends data. But I think it's a welcome addition.
Actually, it was using real financial data, by the way. But
and then on the brand health side, it was probably
I see. Okay, well, that's a separate conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to add to that response, when I was at Google, we worked on food trends reports, and what we concluded was it was, related to interest as opposed to related to sales or brand health. And what I mean by that is if there's news about a company, your brand health will spike, but it could be good news or bad news. It could erode your brand health. So this is really a good indicator of the public's general interest in a specific brand, but there are some pitfalls and some cleaning that needs to occur for that. Way back, they had the Google Trend or the Google Correlate, where they looked at flu trends versus flu symptom queries to relate the two. But once news started promoting a lot of information about flus, the searches went up because the interest went up, not the cases of flu necessarily. So that would be one pitfall that I would mention, is that if your brand is getting mentioned in the news a lot, it's not necessarily a good thing, right? You see Black Swan events immediately. Yep, exactly. Cool. So I think this rounds it out, where we came in at basically an hour. So Dominique Hanssens, aka Mike, thank you for coming in. And John, hopefully I did well. Don't fire me. And everyone else that's on the chat, thank you for the great conversation. And please show up for the next one. The next one will be on Tuesday, February 20th at 11 a.m. with Dr. Kuhn Powles, our newest expert advisor, as we continue the conversations with the front lines of marketing, measurement, analytics, measurement and marketing analytics. That was a mouthful. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.